Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. This will be Part 9, Chapter 5, the second half. It took hours for Izuku to review all the hero agencies that had ties with UA, hero agencies that had teaching licenses or individuals with teaching licenses, those who had or currently have interns from UA, and any with a history of taking in multiple sidekicks. Once he had gotten a good idea on who was available, several hours later, and with several pages of a new notebook filled, he began a separate search. He needed to find heroes and agencies that might take him on, and be able to teach him something he needed to know. He could research and practice the basics of heroics work himself, or learn at UA. What he needed from his work placement was something he could use to level the playing field, or give himself an edge. With both lists compiled, dot-pointed notes on each agency included, he was able to cross-reference them to get the best possible choices. There were only a handful, and most were a long shot or functionally useless, but one stood out. It took him until the next evening to review everything, but it seemed that everything really did lead back to All Might. Because who would be better to teach him how to fight using analysis than Sir Nighteye? While he was famous for being All Might's sidekick, more than anything else, he was a talented investigator and analyst, and due to his non-combative quirk, he fought quirkless. Now all Izuku had to do was find a way to convince the hero to take him on during the work placement week. The bags under his eyes weren't getting any lighter, but as he opened another tab and turned to a new page of his notebook, he steeled himself. He wouldn't let himself get left behind. It started with Ida. Hitoshi hadn't really been paying attention, more focused on staying awake enough to use his chopsticks and get through lunch. But Ida had been talking about his quirk, what he could do, and the problems he'd been having with it while training. Midoriya hadn't looked much better than Hitoshi felt, but after Ida stopped talking for a moment, he'd blinked a couple times before words had fallen out of his mouth like a waterfall after a flood. Hitoshi was worried about his friend. He always looked kinda wrecked, and when asked, had spoken about expanding his exercise routine and not sleeping well, though tiring himself out helped. Hitoshi, after watching him be lightly tortured by a villain and admit how many supposed heroes had crushed his dreams, could take a guess as to why he might be sleeping badly. But as soon as anyone showed concern, Midoriya perked up, a very well-made if somewhat crooked mask put on, and arms trying to physically wave off the worry. Hitoshi hadn't really tried to ask about it after the first time, leaving that up to Uraraka and Ida, who had accepted him so quickly after Midoriya had invited him to join them at lunch. God, did it feel nice to talk without being judged, and to have friends. Instead, he focused on making sure people left Midoriya alone, or reminded him not to mutter in class, and shared a bit of his lunch here and there. The smiles he got for that kind of stuff were far more genuine than the ones they got when the "don't worry about me" mask came up. Honestly, Hitoshi doesn't know why they expected Midoriya to open up to them, or stop hiding whatever was troubling him, considering this was the same kid who had escaped villains and had asked everyone else if they were all right, when he was the one covered in blood and sounding like his lungs were about to give in. He was also the same kid who had apparently asked over 200 heroes if any of them thought he could be one. Getting shot down and told you'd never make it was something Hitoshi was painfully aware of, but never on that scale. Never after that much work. He had so many questions about everything that had been said in that interaction, but that was for Midoriya to share when he was ready. It had definitely made him glad that he had reached out in the first place, since it was pretty clear Midoriya had been alone for too long. Now, Hitoshi kind of wished he'd tried to befriend someone else in the class, after Midoriya had come up with an exercise routine for Ida, along with a recommendation to try dance to help with flexibility and tight turns. Hitoshi had made the mistake of jokingly asking for help to prevent him from getting kicked out of the heroics course. Instead of laughing or maybe encouraging Hitoshi, he'd put a finger to his lips and started muttering about Hitoshi's quirk, before outright asking him what his limits were, even though from what Hitoshi could pick up, Midoriya had already figured out most of them. When Hitoshi had admitted there was a lot he wasn't sure of due to lack of opportunity to practice, Midoriya had gone on a tangent, coming up with ideas and writing down whole lists on a notebook he'd gotten from somewhere. When Uraraka had pointed out that Hitoshi still needed to practice with someone, Midoriya hadn't even hesitated in saying that he could do it, if Hitoshi was all right with that. Having anyone want to help or be directly affected by his quirk was something that Hitoshi had never had, so of course he'd agreed to practice with Midoriya after school. Since that afternoon, he hadn't known peace. They'd tested every limit they could think of for his quirk, Within reason, Hitoshi would never forgive himself if Midoriya was hurt because of him. Before, Midoriya had asked about his exercise routine, and Hitoshi had admitted to his spotty, cobbled-together routine. That evening, he'd been given a full plan with focus on both physical and quirk growth that put him through hell, but would apparently improve his abilities greatly. At the moment, he felt less improved and more like the physical embodiment of screechy beginner violin music. Midoriya had even accounted for his insomnia, the asshole. The plan was so personalized and had his best interest in heart. There was even a second page that was for a lighter version of the routine if he wanted to work up to it. Hitoshi rarely had people go to this sort of effort for him, so it was heartwarming, the amount of care that went into this. But he'd seen Uraraka's determined face when the sports festival was announced, been accidentally hit as Ida had talked about his brother, and heard Midoriya talk back to that villain, working beyond hope. He wasn't going to take his spot lightly, and had thrown himself headfirst into training. Still hurt like a bitch. Only a couple days into hell training, and Hitoshi felt some grim satisfaction as he watched Uraraka approach the sleepless duo desks. It would catch on once Midoriya admitted he was just as bad at getting a good night's sleep as he was, and asked Midoriya if he had any tips for her. Suffering does love company and all that. Hitoshi let Midoriya's rambles on calculating weight faster to figure out limits and tips for combating nausea go in through one ear and out the other. He'd only stopped talking for a moment when one of their other classmates began asking for tips, and eventually, a group was stationed around their desks asking for help. He snorted, though immediately regretted the action, as it used too many of his aching abdominal muscles. Maybe Midoriya's plan for the sports festival was to have all of them kill themselves with these routines so that he would have one less class to compete against. From Midoriya Izuku to Sir Nighteye. Subject: UA Work Placement Week. Hello, Sir Nighteye. My name is Midoriya Izuku, and I'm a student at UA High School. I'm a part of the heroics course at the school, Class 1A, and I'm aiming to graduate from there in order to become a pro hero. UA's education encourages practical experience in order to ensure students are best suited for heroics work by the time they graduate. Part of this experience comes from the Work Experience Week that follows the annual sports festival. I'm interested in working closely with your agency during this week. However, I'm aware that you are not one of the 40 agencies that volunteer to take on students who don't receive offers. For that reason, I know my chance to work with you is not guaranteed. That is why I'm sending you this email. I know it is uncommon for students to reach out like this, especially in their first year when there's no record of ability that agencies can access, and therefore they cannot judge whether or not the student would be worthy of the agency's time. But I will put it simply. I'm quirkless. I've been denied many opportunities because of this and will not allow myself to fall behind my peers. So I've chosen to reach out. Your agency would be a great fit for me, due to several factors. While not an underground agency, you still employ some level of anonymity, and focus on practical work rather than marketing and sponsorships. There is a strong investigative and analytic side to your agency, though standard hero work such as patrolling regularly is also part of the agency routine. You, Sir Nighteye, have a non-combative quirk, and therefore would know how to approach physical combat without relying on a quirk to assist you. The agency currently has a teaching license and the ability to take on student heroes, as shown through Togeda Mirio, the third-year student currently interning at the agency. Skills that I could use to benefit the agency and assist with hero work include extensive knowledge on navigating social media and other networking websites, analytical experience with individuals, groups, situations involving villainous and criminal activity, pattern recognition of individuals, groups, events, and incidents, access to the deep web and searching programs to help discover more information, programming and cybersecurity evaluation, knowledge of rescue and evacuation protocol, long-range combat ability with a sling. Unfortunately, I do not have any practical experience yet, but I'm hoping you will consider me for this year's Work Placement Week in order for me to gain it. Thank you for your time. Midoriya Izuku. From Sir Nighteye to Midoriya Izuku. Subject: UA Work Placement Week. Midoriya. I've investigated who you say you are and appears to be the truth. However, I would like to know how you were able to reach this email. It is on a secure network, and only those with official email addresses or network connections should be able to get into contact. If you do not have a sufficient answer, I will have to report you for breaking into the system and acting as a threat to the integrity of Japanese heroics. While reaching out like this is admirable, we don't give handouts for simply being proactive. You will have to go through the same processes and procedures as everyone else. One intern from UA does not mean other positions are open. We are not currently accepting students for work placement. and definitely not first years with no experience. Having a more in-depth understanding of the internet than your peers and an interest in analytics does not qualify you for special treatment. Do not contact me again on this matter. Regards, Sir Nighteye. From Midoriya Izuku to Sir Nighteye. Subject, UA Work Placement Week. Sir Nighteye, I would like to politely argue that I'm not asking for special treatment. I simply want your consideration. I found in the past that even if I try and stand out or achieve above my peers, I've been overlooked repeatedly due to nothing more than the fact that I am quirkless. To answer your question on contact methods, while the network is encrypted, it still uses the regular internet to function, rather than an internet that some agencies and organizations prefer to use for internal matters. Therefore, I was able to use a proxy that took my email address and replaced it with a coding for an official address. This allowed access to the network. Naming conventions for official hero emails is the same across all Japan, so once I'd conducted research into the structure for these emails, I was able to deduce what yours would be, as I knew the name of your agency along with your hero name. I don't have access to the network in a traditional manner. This proxy only grants me the ability to send and receive emails, and I have to be able to figure out what the email is, as I do not have access to any kind of address book. There's no hacking involved, and no breaches to the network, so this method is not illegal to utilize. This is not simply using the internet. If you'd like proof of my analysis, then I can put together a sampling based on whatever conditions you set and send those through as an example. If you'd like something specific analyzed, perhaps something current so you can be sure that I've not plagiarized my work, then let me know and I will include that as well. I also have another offer, if you would like proof of ability before making the decision to take on a first-year student. You work with foresight and analysis, and I would like to prove that I'm capable of both. Therefore, I offer to predict the outcomes of this year's sports festival. This would include events, class placement in these events, potential winners, and the results of the workplace offers from other agencies after the festival is concluded. If the sports festival passes, and I've miscalculated in my predictions, then you can be sure I'll never contact you on this matter again. However, if I get them right, I would like for you and your agency to give me some serious consideration, even though I'm only a first-year student. Thank you for your time. Midoriya Izuku. From Sir Nighteye to Midoriya Izuku. Subject, UA Work Placement Week. Midoriya, I forwarded this information on gaining access to the network managers. While you were right that this was not a breach of the law, it was a breach of conduct. Since you seem confident in your abilities, here are the terms your predictions must meet. You cannot be vague with terms. There are to be no alternate readings of your predictions. Each event, with a small margin of error, must be predicted. The winners of these events, with 2 backup options, must be predicted. You must predict which students will receive the most work experience offers. You must predict your own offers. In addition, I will only be evaluating the validity of your predictions if the analysis portfolio you send is of a professional standard. Please attach it with your next email. Regards, Sir Nighteye. Izuku put his head in his hands. He had a chance. He'd felt like a fake, a liar, talking himself up like that, but it was worth the discomfort because he'd gotten himself a chance. Sir Nightaye's terms were pretty strict, but he could work with them. First, he'd have to assemble a good portfolio of his analysis, with a few additional new ones for good measure. While Sir Nighteye hadn't asked for new ones as proof that none of his works were plagiarized, Izuku wasn't going to risk anything. And then, he just had to predict the outcomes of the sports festival. That was another thing that made him feel like a fraud, because he used it for a selling point even though he was already going to try and do that to give himself an advantage. Every year he did a bit of prediction at the sports festival. He usually just kept it to himself since his mom pointed out that it was less suspenseful to watch when he was already talking about the outcomes 2 events ahead. This time would be similar to the many sports festivals they'd watched together. Only he had to factor himself in, and do so objectively. He went ahead and grabbed a fresh notebook and put that aside for later tonight. For now, he switched to the email account he used for his forum accounts, so he could respond to the latest email he'd received. He felt a bit guilty, having put off answering for a couple of days in order to focus on his research and correspondence with Sir Nighteye. Recently, he'd been covering the flawed idea of true heroes that Stain kept insisting on, their last topic being focused on the monetary aspect of heroics. People deserve to live comfortably and safe when not working, and unfortunately, money is required for that. He'd pointed out that there was an argument for smaller salaries so people weren't as drawn to the job purely for monetary gain and to exploit their popularity to get merchandise sales and sponsorships. though those two things were an entirely different matter to do with the celebrity-like status the media assigned to heroes. It seemed that Stain had latched onto that final point, starting off fairly well, arguing that the celebrity status wasn't warranted for people who should be regarded as public servants, but that quickly devolved into a quirk talk about how pros use their quirks to be more flashy and didn't truly care for heroics. It was part way through one of his rants that Izuku noticed the throwaway line. If they won't use their quirk properly, and instead use them for their own gain, they might as well be quirkless so they could never become heroes in the first place. The rest of the email kept going on about how it was up to Stain to cull those who would jeopardize society with quirk use. While he could not argue against the fact that perfection was subjective, and corruption was inherent but could be managed from a systematic vantage, and killing wouldn't necessarily carry across the intended message, and all people had a right to be compensated for their work, especially when it took years of training and carried a risk to their life, he would not let go of that conviction. Even if it wasn't through killing, he argued that the heroes, and villains, because Stain had never stopped the work he'd begun as Stendhal, had to be stopped, and he was the one who was willing to act. Izuku read over the email a couple of times, noting Stain's powerful quirk bias that he didn't seem to be aware of. As usual, the villain raised valid concerns, even though they were getting more flimsy as he tried to argue why his specific ideology and his actions were right. As usual, Izuku had points he could use to combat Stain's arguments. But he couldn't stop going back to that sentence. It was phrased in a way that implied that someone having their quirk removed would condemn them, and that being quirkless would be a worse outcome than the usual threat of death Stain advocated for. And it was bad being quirkless. Izuku had the scars to prove it, but... From Small Might 1234 to AC. Subject: Please stop spreading hateful messages. You don't rely on your quirk when you attack heroes. Sure, it helps, especially if you can ambush the heroes and get their blood before they realize what's happening, like you usually do, but you fight quirkless. A lot of heroes do, since their quirks are non-combative. Why can't someone quirkless be a hero? Pattern analysis was very important and a great tool for prediction. It was also useful to have a second pair of eyes to give some fresh input when you'd already spent hours working on certain projects. Nezu figured that turning it into a teaching experience would be beneficial to both him and Midoriya, so he decided their afternoon's lesson could be spent focusing on it. Besides, he'd seen some similar analysis in his journals, and was interested to watch how the child approached the task. Midoriya worked mostly in silence, the only sound permeating the office being the scratch of pen on paper, but that was fine with Nezu. He told his student to write down his observations as Nezu flicked through different images, and at the end, they could review the information gathered. However, having recently changed images to a city overview with attack markers overlaid, his student stopped writing. He narrowed his eyes for a moment, scribbled a quick note before turning to look at Nezu. You're missing an attack in West Sakado, a failed ambush at Wakaba Station, and the one unconfirmed attack was definitely Stain. Kikai was getting drunk and abusing his quirk fairly consistently, then using his standing as a hero to avoid consequences. After casting a quick eye over the overview to make sure there were no notes that this was specifically mapping the serial killer's attack patterns, Nezu turned to his student. You've studied Stain's patterns? Yes. Midoriya fiddled with his pen, but he didn't look away, which was an improvement compared to their first few meetings. I've been aware of Stain for a while. Indeed. Nezu didn't like to pressure Midoriya for more information since he always became more closed off as the conversations progressed, but sometimes he needed a bit of prompting so Nezu could get the whole story. I'm on a lot of online forums, and Stain's manifesto was popping up across a couple of them, so I investigated where it came from, and then later Stain himself. If Nezu had eyebrows, they would have risen. It was impressive that Midoriya had found enough information to be able to recognize Stain's attack pattern on sight, but it did bring forth a problem. Why didn't you tell me about any of this? Any information you have could be something we have not yet discovered. I thought I'd made it clear that I would value any information you had to bring forward. Midoriya hunched in on himself at that, though Nezu had tried to keep his tone gentle. I thought you meant big things, like the landslide. I didn't think I should bother anyone with this. I'm working on it. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. Nezu tried to add another piece to his mental puzzle on Midoriya Izuku, and was again left more confused because the piece didn't fit. Midoriya had shown himself to be quite caring and aware, so to brush off something like this didn't quite make sense. Heroes being killed is usually considered a big deal. Heroes are trained to deal with situations like that. He shrugged, but it was not the carefree gesture that most people would have used. He shrugged, like he was trying to readjust whatever weight had taken up residence on his shoulders. Besides, I knew it was already being investigated by multiple heroes along with the police, so there's not much I could do on that front. It was then that Nezu paused, and looked back at the words Midoriya had chosen. In their meeting, he often chose not to speak, unless he got into a rant. Most of his words tended to be measured for that reason, and usually held some level of importance. What do you mean? Working on it? Midoriya froze. He was quick to begin talking, but Nezu had seen the moment he'd recognized a mistake. What was it that his student didn't want him to know? His current explanations were all running in circles, and Nezu was beginning to worry that he'd misjudged Midoriya, and he was about to learn that his student was indeed involved in vigilantism. However, when Midoriya finally untangled the story he was trying to tell, it was something else entirely. He spoke about finding information on Stain, getting into contact with the villain, and trying to convince him to stop, because killing people wasn't the way to produce real change. Nezu listened attentively, and by the end wanted to yell at his student to ask why he didn't think to tell anyone about what he'd been doing. Giving himself a second to repress that urge, he asked politely, I can understand why you're so hesitant to share information, as people have ignored you in the past. But why not share this? And why try to talk a serial killer into seeing reason? There was a long pause this time, Midoriya clearly debating how best to answer. In the end, the boy elected to stare holes into his notebook and let out a quiet, I've done it before. Explain. Midoriya must have expected Nezu to demand answers, given that he didn't dance around the topic this time. He just spoke, in plain terms, about reaching out to multiple villains as if they were acquaintances about to make an arbitrary mistake, and Nezu gave up on the puzzle he was trying to put together of Midoriya. To put it simply, Nezu was terrified of what Midoriya was capable of. He was fully aware that the student was talented and could easily turn that talent towards hurting others. This only made him more glad that Midoriya had instead chosen to keep working towards becoming a hero and improving other people's lives. He had heard from Aizawa 113 what the boy had admitted at the USJ, that he had a toxic mindset and no one to help him, yet he was still trying to help others. The way he explained what he was doing, it was easy to believe that it was just a slow, ineffective method that involved talking a lot, but Nezu had heard of a few villains Midoriya mentioned. To change someone's mindset like that, to make them turn away from violence and hate through using kindness, was something monumental. It had been a long time since Nezu had seen compassion like that, and longer still since the person who'd held it understood the world, and had still been able to use it to effectively help others. He still admonished the boy for keeping the information to himself, but made sure to once again reiterate that he was on his side, and any information was good information to share. Midoriya had smiled then, and Nezu had smiled back, satisfied with the growing trust he was building with the student, and confident that no matter what happened, Midoriya would not give in to villainy. From Sir Nighteye to Midoriya Izuku. Subject, UA Work Placement Week. Midoriya, thank you for sending through your predictions and analysis portfolio. There is far more material here than I was expecting, but it passes our basic requirements. Due to this, I will watch your performance at the sports festival and evaluate your predictions. I will wait for your final email after the sports festival, when you've received information on work placement numbers. After that, I will give you my answer on whether or not I will accept your placement. Regards, Sir Nighteye. Izuku sent a quick email thanking Sir Nighteye for the opportunity before he went straight back to work. There weren't enough hours in the day to get everything done, but he had to keep trying anyway. There was no safety net for someone like him. Quirkless, which meant he was weak, pathetic, useless, worthless, but why? So he had to make his own, and ensure that he didn't fall, no matter what. He kept working. The energy in the classroom had really started to shift with less than 1 week left to the sports festival, all the students becoming more tense in anticipation for the national event. It was Ashido who finally snapped, standing at her desk the moment classes were done for the day. That's it! We're going to the arcade! She punctured the statement by putting her hands on her hips, as if waiting for someone to challenge her and tell her to train more. Izuku watched as several students looked between each other, Kirishima finally being the one to speak up as he gestured at the whole classroom. We? Yep! Ashido picked up her bag, flinging one strap over her shoulder with a flourish. Anyone who's free, you're coming to the arcade with me. Chatter began to pick up along with the general mood as the class began to organize themselves and their upcoming trip. It was nice background noise as Izuku packed up his desk. He wasn't really paying much attention to what was actually being said until Suyu called out to him. "What about you, Midoriya?" She was watching him with her large eyes, head tilted with a finger on her chin. He noted a few other people had turned to look at him at her question. His first instinct was to say no, since the only times he'd been asked to go somewhere, it had been as a joke, or to find somewhere new to beat him up without any witnesses. But as his gaze drifted to Uraraka, Ida, and Shinso, who all made various gestures indicating they were going, he changed his answer. "Yeah, okay." He didn't quite trust the full class yet, but he trusted those three. By the time they'd all packed up and started making their way to the agreed-upon arcade, most of the class had joined the impromptu excursion. Izuku had always wanted to go to an arcade, but he'd never been truthfully invited. He didn't exactly want to go himself either, considering the likelihood of running into one of his classmates at the local arcade was pretty high. Echoes of jeering laughter after fake invites were offered haunted him, but they were easy enough to drown out with the bustle that was getting nearly 20 students through public transport together. It was fun, if somewhat chaotic. When they'd finally made it to the place, Izuku felt a bit lost. He wasn't sure what he was actually meant to do. With such a last-minute plan, he hadn't brought much money he could use on the games, and he didn't want to try and ask someone else for money when they might be in a similar situation. He finally found something to focus on. Aside from the constant changing lights and sounds, how did anyone not get a headache from spending more than an hour in here? When he spotted Shinso staring at a claw machine, looking like he was 2 seconds away from trying to break the limits of his quirk and demanded to give him what he wanted. As soon as he stepped into the mind controller's line of sight, he turned that dead-eyed stare to him. "This thing is rigged." "Really?" Izuku knew carnival games were often impossible to win by design, but he had no idea if it was the same with arcade games. "Yes. No. Maybe." Shinso let out a deep sigh, pressing his forehead against the glass of the claw machine. "I've already spent 400 yen trying to get the black cat, and I even managed to get in the claw, but then nope, slipped right off, and here I am catless." Izuku tried to get a look at the game to figure out if it worked, but it was a bit hard to do without playing, along with the tall purple-haired heroic student who was still staring into the sea of plushies longingly and blocking the view. "Would I be able to try?" Shinso finally broke away from his vigil, though his eyes were still glued to the cat. "Go ahead. If it's rigged, then we can work together and break into it. If your training is anything like the regime you gave me, then you can swing me into the glass like a baseball bat, and we can make a run for it with all the animal plushies we could ever want." It was such a monotonous delivery, but the image conjured by Shinso's words made Izuku laugh. He didn't even have time to hold it back. Sure, it was a bit violent, but Shinso was significantly taller than him. So the idea of swinging him around to commit a crime in the name of animal plushies of all things was hilarious. Shinso stared at him blankly for a few seconds, maybe wondering why anyone would laugh at such a foolproof plan, before his face also broke into a smile. Still giggling a bit, he made his way to the controls and inserted his money. The movements of the claw were pretty erratic, especially because it swung once it stopped moving, so you had to wait for that to stop before you dropped it down. But it wasn't impossible to control. The grip was also pretty loose, but as Izuku watched it latch onto a turtle near the cat, only to slip off due to the way the plushies surrounding the turtle held it down, he reasoned that it wasn't impossible to win. Having conducted his test, he turned back to Shinso. "You're going to need at least 500 more yen to get the black cat. You'd have to grab 4 other plushies before the cat would be free enough that the grip strength of the claw would be enough to pull it up and out." The other boy nodded sagely a couple times before grabbing Izuku's hand and placing a pile of coins in it. Izuku took a breath to protest, or at least ask what was going on, when Shinso interrupted him. "Please, God of claw machines, do it for me. These things hate me. They sense my quirk and go out of their way to not be controlled." Shinso didn't break character once, which set Izuku into another bout of laughter. "Fine, I'll do my best." "Thank you." There was a relief in Shinso's voice and no small amount of distrust in the glare he sent the machine. By the time Izuku was done, he had a dog, chicken, and 2 raccoons set to the side, and a black cat in his arms. Shinso's earlier words in mind, he bowed, holding out the toy in front of himself. "To my devoted worshipper, your cat plushie." Both of them snorted, smiling at the cat plushie that was now held protectively against Shinso's chest. "What should we do with the rest of them?" Izuku shrugged as he picked them up, waiting for Shinso to decide, since they were won with his money. "Let's find Uraraka and Ida. Maybe they'll want one." Decision made, the 2 of them set off in search of their classmates. It didn't take them very long to find Ida. A whole group of students were watching as he faced Ashido at DDR, getting brutally murdered at each arrow scrolled down the screen. "Hey guys, you ready to face the Queen of Dance Dance Revolution?" Ashido looked at them from her platform, still keeping up with the moves while Ida looked like he would be hard-pressed to win against a brick. "That isn't really a question, by the way." Jiro spoke up from her position by Shinso. "She's making everyone go around against her. She's paying for each first round, but if you want a rematch, loser pays." "I am, however, a benevolent queen," she said as the scores came up on the screen and Ida gracefully took his leave without even looking at his grave marker. "So if you don't have the money, you can always trade me, maybe that adorable plush in your arms." "I will use my quirk on you if I even think you're going to try and take my cat." "Fair enough." She clapped her hands together, completely unfazed by the threat. "What about you, Midoriya? Willing to put a few of your cuddly friends on the line?" Izuku looked down at the plushies he didn't need in his arms, then to Shinso, who they technically belonged to. He just shrugged, so Izuku figured it would be fine. "Sure?" "You heard it here, folks. The champion gets 4 plushies. Now, for the next contestant." When neither Shinso nor Izuku made a move, she called for Shinso to join her. Leaving his cat with Izuku, though only after extracting a promise that he would protect it with his life, Shinso began his match against Ashido. He managed fairly well, though he couldn't keep up with her. And then, Izuku was pulled up. He was not someone who danced, had never had reason to, but reacting quickly was something he had to get very good at to not get himself killed when free running. So the good news was he was managing to hit nearly all the arrows on time. The bad news was he felt like a cross between a plank of wood and one of the air-filled tube men outside of the car dealership that waved around randomly. When the round finally ended, the scores weren't too far apart, but the sheer technical skill wasn't enough against someone who could actually dance. "Hey, you almost got her!" The others were applauding, Tokiyami and Shoji having joined the group while Izuku was competing. "On screen, maybe. Dude, have you ever danced in your life?" Kaminari was met with an elbow to the ribs from Jiro, but the laughs he got for his comment didn't feel mocking to Izuku. "Okay, but he has potential." Izuku pulled a face at Ojiro for that comment. He certainly didn't feel like he'd ever be good at dancing after that performance. "Potential?" And oh, that was Hagekure's hand on his shoulder. "That was the closest anyone has come to beating her." "Silence! Who will next challenge the queen?" Ashido, to her credit, didn't look a bit out of breath, standing on her chosen battleground. Hagekure stepped forward from beside Izuku, rolling her sleeves up. "Oh, you are on! This time I'm going to win! For honor! For plushies!" The rest of the class joined in the honor and plushies chant, even Ida, though he kept reminding them not to get too loud, until they were interrupted by Uraraka and Yagirozu, returning with snacks. After promising Ashido they could return to DDR after eating, they managed to make their way over to the small cafeteria-like area, picking up the last couple of classmates as they went. There was talking, planning what games to play next, and increasingly ridiculous suggestions on how to win. It was as he was surrounded by a group of his classmates, all chatting and eating and having fun, that he realized he had friends. He had friends. Izuku felt lighter than he had in who knows how long. There was no planning and analyzing, no pressure or fear, just having fun. Before he knew it, tears were slipping down his face. He tried to blink them away, but that just encouraged more to fall, and set off his nose. "Midoriya, are you all right?" Uraraka's words got everyone's attention, and soon they were all speaking over each other, trying to ask him if he was all right, what was wrong, and blaming Ashido for beating him in DDR so badly he cried, which started a side argument that he'd done fairly well, and if anyone should be crying, it would be Ida. Izuku quickly scrubbed the worst of the tears off his face, though they were quickly replaced. "I'm fine, really." He gave the whole table a smile, the expression coming easily and without pretense. He hoped it would make up for how watery his voice sounded. I cry easily. These are happy tears, I promise." "Aw, Midoriya." "Hey, you can't cry. We still need to decide what we're doing next." "Here, take one of the plushies back." Izuku knew that tonight he would have to go back to planning and preparing and jumping through who knew what hoops. But right now, he was surrounded by his classmates, his friends, at an arcade he never would have expected to be invited to. He could forget about everything else and have fun, just for now. By the end of the afternoon, Mina was crowned the first 1A dance champion, and gracefully accepted her prize of 3 plushies and a much lighter purse from paying everyone to face her. Everyone was still waiting in anticipation for the sports festival, but Izuku could feel how much lighter the atmosphere had gotten with her afternoon. It had taken him a while to think of a response. Actually, it has taken Chizome a while to respond to most of the essay-like emails that have been sent to him. Paragraphs and paragraphs highlighting the very issues that he sought to remove from this plagued society. But not once has his pen pal agreed with Chizome's ideology nor conceded to his points. There was always some long, convoluted other way with less bloodshed. They had even had the audacity to contact Chizome after he'd gotten rid of Starburst, demanding a list of the hero's crimes and proof of said crimes. Apparently, Chizome's reasoning hadn't been enough, because he had been subject to some very creative insults followed by a full analysis on society, the workings of the heroic system, and several examples on how to bring about a proper revival of heroes without killing the fakes. It had taken several days for Chizome to go through all the documents, some obsessive part of himself not letting him simply discard the information. Afterwards, he had had to take another day to let what he had learned sink in. Not once had his pen pal called his ideals wrong, only the execution, again writing that Chizome was only creating martyrs and staining himself for what would amount to be very little. They also tended to ask how Chizome was doing, and on the first occasion that Chizome had given his pen pal something to work with, aching muscles, a side effect of running over rooftops and hunting down pro-heroes, he'd received a list on the things he could do to improve his situation. Instructions, links, essays. There was always a wall of text waiting to be parsed through when he opened his inbox. The email in front of him was nothing like the essays he'd previously received. He wouldn't say he had been eagerly waiting for the response to his previous argument, but he had been interested to see how Small Might would challenge Chizume's ideals and introduce a new path. But this email was only 4 sentences. The first 3 revealed that they knew about his quirk, which meant if their previous research abilities could be relied on, they could find out Chizume's identity if they hadn't already. After all, one of the first things they had asked him about was his time as Stendhal. And yet Chizume had been living his life unchanged since coming in contact with his pen pal. He was still cautious, but no more than usual. What kind of person found a serial killer and spoke to them rather than reporting them? Chizume believed his answer could lie in the final sentence of this email. A question. His pen pal liked to ask questions, always wanting to know more, but this one was interesting. They were asking if someone quirkless, like them, as Chizume had learned after getting into a heated argument about quirks and the bias people like Small Might had from having ideal quirks, only to find out his pen pal had none, could be a hero. He had no idea what the answer to that question should be, nor how he should respond to the fact that while he still had no idea who he was talking to aside from some quirkless person who uses hero forums, they knew who he was. It was these reasons that made him consider his response for so long, staring at his reply late into the night. Chizume watched the clock past 2 a.m. before he finally began typing. He had a mission, blood already on his hands, and while his convictions may have wavered in front of the past messages of his pen pal and their well-structured reasoning, he never stopped believing in the revival of true heroes. He may not have plans to make more martyrs, but he still had targets. They had just changed slightly. So he sent off his final email before tucking his phone into his duffel bag, nestled in some old sweater to protect it from his knives. He almost felt a sense of regret, knowing it may be some time before he got to speak with Small Might again. He had grown fond of their conversations, and owed them for his new sense of direction. He would miss them. Shaking his head to clear it of such sentimental thoughts, Chizume set out into the night. From AC to Small Might 1234. Subject: Please stop spreading hateful messages. Small Might. This will be the last you hear of me for some time, I should think. You've hinted at knowing my patterns and how I operate in the past, but you've never threatened to use it against me, which made me believe you were staying in contact to learn more about me to track me down while building up a rapport. But revealing you know my quirk, especially in such a casual manner, means that you've probably known it for a while, and that this was never about tracking me down. I think you could have, if you'd wanted to, but you haven't. Instead, you've argued every point I've brought forward, tried to protect the heroic scum that fills society these days. Except you've agreed on several points, pointed out the flaws on a personal and systematic level. I don't understand you, but I do understand your logic. There must be someone willing to stain their hands with the blood of the unworthy to fix a society, and I will fulfill that role. But I'm going to take a step back and evaluate just who must fall to my blades to bring about a proper revival of heroics. You have taught me that martyrs are their own symbol that ensures my words cannot stand up to the twisted logic society consumes. I do not think my methods or judgment are harsh, but for the sake of someone who listened and clearly wants to better the world, I will make sure to complete a thorough investigation before I draw blood again. You will know I have begun my work anew because you will have no argument that those I have dispatched had any positive influence on the world. Do not try to become a hero. There are far too many unworthy ones who would only taint the truth you can clearly see, and the kindness that you still somehow carry despite knowing what lies beyond the shiny surface of our society. Goodbye. Stain. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 5 of When One Thing Ends, Another Can Begin. I genuinely love this fic. I think there's so many unique aspects to it that I just don't see very often. Izuku talking down Stain is the coolest thing to me. Like, the responses both between Izuku and Nighteye, the conversation with Nezu, it's all just so well done. I really like this fic a lot. So I'm eager to hear what you all thought of this chapter as well. And as always, thank you so much for listening.